The cold was a thief. It stole the feeling from her fingers first, then her toes, creeping up her legs with a numbness that was almost a comfort. Almost. Naomi pressed a hand against the rough bark of a snow-dusted pine, trying to catch the breath that the wind kept snatching from her lungs. Each exhale was a plume of white vapor, a ghost of the life still inside her. The light blue fabric of her uniform, so practical inside the sprawling mansion, was tissue paper against the biting December air. A sharp, rattling cough tore through her. She tasted iron. She had been walking for what felt like hours, though the oppressive gray sky offered no clues. The long, winding driveway of the Ishikawa estate was designed for cars, not for a dismissed maid on foot. Behind her, the mansion was a distant silhouette of sharp, traditional roofs and glowing modern glass, a fortress of warmth and wealth she was no longer welcome in. Carelessness cannot be tolerated. Mrs. Sato's voice echoed in her mind, sharp and brittle as the porcelain vases she had shattered. 3 of them. An entire dynasty of glazed cherry blossoms and hand-painted cranes, gone in a single, clumsy moment of exhaustion. Her apology had been a useless whisper against the head housekeeper's tirade. Fired. On Christmas Eve, her final pay, a paltry sum, was a thin envelope in the pocket of her flimsy apron. It wouldn't be enough for a ticket home. It was barely enough for a week in a cheap Tokyo hostel. Naomi pushed off the tree, her legs trembling. The snow was getting deeper, swallowing her thin-soled shoes. She thought of her mother and younger brother in Atlanta, waiting for the money she was supposed to send. The shame was a heavy, cold stone in her gut, heavier than the hunger that had been gnawing at her for 2 days. She'd been working double shifts, trying to earn a holiday bonus that no longer existed. Another wave of dizziness washed over her. The pristine white of the landscape began to swim, the edges blurring into a soft, inviting gray. It would be so easy to just lie down, to rest for a moment in the silent, cold embrace of the snow. It looked so much like a bed, a clean, white bed. She took one more step, then another. Her body was a foreign country, refusing to obey the commands of her mind. Her knees buckled. The world tilted, a dizzying spiral of white snow and dark trees. She didn't feel the impact, only a sense of release as the ground came up to meet her. Her last conscious thought was of the color blue, the pale, hopeful blue of her uniform against the absolute, unforgiving white of the snow. The headlights of the Black Century cut through the swirling snow, 2 perfect, golden beams illuminating the fallen figure. The driver, a man with a thick neck and a face like a stone carving, slowed the vehicle to a crawl. "Sir," he said, his voice low. "There is someone in the road." From the back seat, Tatsuya Ishikawa did not immediately look up. He was studying a document, the single overhead light casting his face in sharp planes and deep shadows. His suit was a dark, custom-tailored charcoal, the fabric so fine it seemed to drink the light. The only hint of disorder was the collar of his white shirt, unbuttoned just enough to reveal the black ink of a dragon's tail coiling up the side of his neck. "An accident?" Tatsuya asked, his voice a low rumble, devoid of curiosity. "Accidents were inconvenient." "I do not think so. It looks like one of the staff." That made him look up. His eyes, dark and profoundly still, narrowed. Through the sweep of the wipers, he saw it. A small shape, almost swallowed by the snowdrift at the edge of the drive. And a patch of color. A specific, light blue. The color of his household's uniform. "Stop the car," he commanded. The order was quiet, yet it carried an absolute, immediate authority. The driver had the door open before the car fully stopped. Tatsuya stepped out into the freezing wind, the fine leather of his shoes sinking into the fresh powder. The cold was a physical thing, but he seemed oblivious to it, his focus entirely on the figure lying motionless ahead. He moved with a predatory grace, each step deliberate, crunching softly in the unnatural silence of the snow-covered grounds. He reached her in a dozen long strides. It was a girl. A young woman, really. The one he'd seen sometimes in the hallways, always silent, always with her eyes downcast. the American. Her dark skin was a stark, beautiful contrast to the snow clinging to her eyelashes and her hair. Her face was ashen, her lips tinged with blue. She was dangerously still. He knelt, his gloved hand reaching out not to her, but to the fabric of her sleeve. It was thin, cheap cotton, utterly inadequate for this weather. A flicker of something cold and sharp moved through him. It was not the winter air. It was rage, a quiet, surgical rage that settled deep in his bones. His estate was miles from the nearest station. No one walked from here, especially not in a blizzard, especially not one of his staff, dressed for indoor work. This was not an accident. This was a message, or a monumental failure. In his world, there was little difference between the two. He looked back at the car, his driver standing rigidly at attention, waiting for an order. Tatsuya's gaze was hard enough to cut glass. Then he looked down at the girl again. Her name was, he didn't know it, a failing on his part, one he would correct. Gently, with a care that would have shocked anyone who knew him, he slipped one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath her knees. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight in his arms. As he lifted her, her head lolled back against his chest, a small, unconscious sigh escaping her lips. The sound was unnervingly intimate. For a moment, she was not just a problem to be solved. She was a woman, freezing to death on his land. He carried her back to the car, the snow swirling around his impassive face. He did not feel the cold. All he felt was the slow, steady burn of a question. Who did this? He settled her into the warm leather of the back seat, pulling a cashmere blanket from the side compartment and draping it over her shivering form. Drive, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a register his men knew to fear more than any shout. And get Dr. Abe on the phone. Tell him to meet me at the house in 10 minutes. Then find Mrs. Sato. I want to speak with her. The car pulled away, leaving behind only an indentation in the snow, a single, dark angel where she had fallen. He carried her through the grand entrance himself, ignoring the shocked and fearful glances of the staff who had assembled to greet him. They saw their master, the head of the Ishikawa-gumi, a man who moved through their world like a ghost of immense power, holding a half-frozen maid in his arms. He bypassed the main staircase, heading down a quiet, private corridor to his personal study. The room was his sanctuary, a space of dark wood, leather-bound books, and a single, vast window that overlooked a frozen Zen garden. No one entered this room without his express permission. He laid her down on the long, ox-blood leather sofa, her pale blue uniform stark against the dark hide. Her breathing was shallow, but the warmth of the car, and now the room was starting to bring a faint flush back to her cheeks. He stood over her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He noted the worn-out soles of her shoes, the faint fraying at the edge of her white apron. Details he had never noticed before, details that now felt like an indictment. His lieutenant, Kenji, entered the room silently.
Sir.
Dr. Abe is 5 minutes away. Mrs. Sato is waiting outside. Let her wait, Tatsuya said without turning. His eyes were still on Naomi. He reached out and brushed a snowflake from her temple with the edge of his thumb. The gesture was small, almost unconscious. Find out her name. Kenji, a man who had seen Tatsuya break a man's fingers for a minor lie, watched the gesture with carefully concealed surprise. Her name is Naomi. Naomi Evans. She is 20 years old. From the United States. Naomi, Tatsuya repeated softly. The name felt unfamiliar on his tongue, yet correct. He said it differently than Kenji had. It was not an inventory item. It was a name. Why was she outside, Kenji? Mrs. Sato, she dismissed her. About 3 hours ago. The rage, which had been a controlled burn, sharpened to an icy point. 3 hours. She had been out in that storm for 3 hours. He turned slowly, his gaze finally leaving the girl on the sofa to land on his most trusted man. For what reason? They were just objects.
Things.
He had a warehouse full of more valuable antiquities. Send Mrs. Sato in, he said, his voice lethally calm. The head housekeeper entered, bowing low, her face a mask of nervous deference. Master Ishikawa, welcome home. He did not turn. You fired one of your staff. Yes, sir. The American girl. She was inexcusably clumsy. She destroyed the priceless vases in the gallery. Such carelessness. Priceless. Tatsuya interrupted, finally turning to face her. His eyes were flat, devoid of any emotion. It was a look that terrified his enemies and disciplined his soldiers. Tell me, Mrs. Sato, what is the price of a human life? The woman paled. Sir, I don't understand. She was dismissed 3 hours ago. The snow has been heavy for 6. Did you arrange a car for her? No, sir. It is not our policy. She was terminated for cause. Did you ensure she had a coat for the weather? She has her own belongings, sir. I am not her keeper. That is where you are wrong, Tatsuya said, taking a step closer. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Everyone who resides on this property, who serves this family, is my responsibility. Their well-being is a reflection of my discipline. Their failure is my failure. And your failure, he paused, his voice dropping lower, is my shame. Shame was a word Tatsuya. You saw a foreigner, a disposable girl with no one to speak for her. You saw someone weak, and you decided to exercise your small portion of power on the coldest night of the year. You threw her out into a blizzard to die over broken pottery. He gestured toward the sofa. Look at her. Is her life worth less than a vase? Mrs. Sato risked a glance at Naomi, then quickly looked away, her face ashen. It was a mistake. An error in judgment. I apologize. Your apology is noted, Tatsuya said softly. Kenji. His lieutenant stepped forward. Sir. Mrs. Sato's employment is terminated. Pack her belongings. A car will take her to the station. She will not work in this city again. He looked at the woman, whose face had crumpled in horror. You are dismissed. As Kenji escorted the weeping woman out, Dr. Abe, a small, neat man with kind eyes, hurried in. He went straight to Naomi, his professional gaze assessing her condition. Hypothermia, malnourishment, by the look of it. And yet tonight, under his own roof, a young woman had nearly frozen to death because of a broken vase and a housekeeper's petty cruelty. The pattern of failure was sickeningly familiar. He heard a soft groan from the sofa. He turned. Naomi's eyes were fluttering open. They were a deep, rich brown, clouded with confusion as she took in the opulent room, the strange doctor, and finally, the tall, imposing man standing by the window. Her gaze locked with his. The silence in the room became heavy, charged with unspoken questions. He saw fear in her eyes, but beneath it, there was something else. A flicker of the same resilience that had made her take one more step in the snow before she fell. He made a deliberate choice to help her, not just because she was his responsibility, but because he saw the ghost of his sister and her vulnerability, and a strength that was all her own. He walked over to the sofa, dismissing the doctor with a slight nod of his head. He knelt so that his eyes were level with hers. The proximity was startling. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, something like cedar and cold night air. You are safe now, he said, his voice softer than she would have imagined possible. What is your name? He already knew, but he wanted to hear her say it. Naomi, she whispered, her throat raw. Naomi, he repeated, and the way he said it was a vow. You will not be leaving. It is not safe. Her brow furrowed. But I was fired. The situation has changed, he said, his expression giving nothing away. A rival clan, the Kyokaikai, have been watching this estate. For you to be out there, alone and vulnerable, was a security breach I cannot tolerate. Until I have dealt with them, you are a liability in the world, and an asset here. You will stay. It was not a request. It was the statement of a new reality. She had been dragged from the cold into a gilded cage, chained not by employment, but by the dangerous politics of his world. She was a pawn. But as she looked into his dark, unblinking eyes, she felt a terrifying, unfamiliar flutter of something that wasn't fear. It was the feeling of being seen. Truly seen for the first time in a very long time. Days bled into a strange, Suspended reality. Naomi was moved from the study to a luxurious guest suite with silk sheets and a view of the snow-covered garden. Her light blue uniform was gone, replaced by soft cashmere sweaters and trousers that had appeared silently in her closet. She was a prisoner, but a pampered one. She ate meals that were brought to her on lacquer trays, each dish a work of art. She was told not to leave the suite, for her own safety. Two of Tatsuya's men stood guard outside her door, silent and unmoving. Tatsuya visited once a day. He would enter without knocking, a silent wraith in his perfect suits, and stand by the window, asking her questions. They were not personal. He asked about the layout of the West Wing, the delivery schedules she might have observed, the faces of vendors she might have seen. He was mining her for information, using her unique perspective as a servant who is invisible to most. She answered him honestly, her mind sharp and clear now that she was rested and fed. She told him about the catering truck that sometimes arrived an hour earlier than scheduled, with a driver who never made eye contact. She told him about a window in a third-floor storage room that had a faulty lock, a detail Mrs. Sato had always neglected to fix. She was giving him weapons, pieces of her mundane knowledge that in his world could become tactical advantages. She chose to help him, not out of loyalty, but out of a primal instinct for survival. Her safety was now inextricably linked to his. One evening, he brought a large architectural drawing and spread it across the low table in her room. It was a map of the estate. "Show me the window," he said. She knelt on the floor beside the table, and he knelt opposite her. The space between them felt small, electric. She pointed to a small square on the blueprint. "Here. It overlooks the service road behind the kitchens." He leaned in closer to see, his shoulder brushing against hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her. She could feel the warmth of his body, the solid strength of him. She held her breath. He didn't pull away immediately. His eyes were on the map, but his focus seemed to be somewhere else entirely. He was so close she could see the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a tiny imperfection in his carved face. "The driver of the catering truck," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You said he did not make eye contact. What else?" "He had a tattoo," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "On his wrist. A spider lily." Tatsuya's head snapped up. His eyes met hers, and the intensity in them stole her breath. A spider lily was the symbol of the Kyokaikai. Her small observation had just confirmed his suspicions. The threat was not just outside the gates, it was already inside. That was the moment the ground shifted. He wasn't just protecting her from a hypothetical danger anymore. The danger was here, and she had just handed him the proof. He saw her not as a fragile liability, but as a source. Perceptive. Intelligent. Different from the sycophants and soldiers who surrounded him. The attack came 2 nights later. Not with a frontal assault, but with the quiet, insidious poison of betrayal. The power to the estate was cut. The emergency generators failed to kick in, sabotaged. The house was plunged into a terrifying darkness, broken only by the cold, blue moonlight on the snow outside. Naomi's door was thrown open. It wasn't one of the guards. It was Tatsuya himself. In the dim light, she saw he had shed his suit jacket. He wore only his white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the dense, intricate tapestry of his tattoos. He held a pistol in his hand, holding it with a familiarity that was more chilling than any overt threat. "They are in the house," he said, his voice tight with control. "Stay behind me." He pulled her from the room, his hand gripping her upper arm. His touch was firm, possessive. He moved through the darkened hallways with a silent, lethal purpose. The sounds of struggle echoed from the main part of the house, shouts, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor. Tatsuya ignored them, leading her down a service corridor she knew well. He was moving her toward an escape route. They rounded a corner and came face to face with 2 men, dressed in black, their faces obscured by masks. They held knives, not guns. They wanted this to be quiet. Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs. Tatsuya pushed her behind him, shielding her with his body. The men lunged. What happened next was a blur of brutal, balletic violence. Tatsuya moved like a shadow, a whirlwind of precise, economical motion. It wasn't a fight, it was a disassembly. An arm was broken with a sickening crack. A knife was turned back on its owner. It was over in less than 10 seconds. Two bodies lay motionless on the floor. Tatsuya didn't have a scratch on him, but his breathing was slightly heavier. He turned to her, his chest rising and falling. A stray beam of moonlight caught the side of his face. A thin line of blood trickled from a shallow cut on his cheek, a place where a blade had almost found its mark. He had almost been lost to her. The thought hit her with the force of a physical blow. They were trapped. More footsteps were approaching from both ends of the hall. He pressed her back into a small alcove, a utility closet. There was no way out. "I can create a diversion," she whispered, her mind racing, connecting the pieces of her servant's knowledge. "The main gas line for the West Wing kitchen runs behind this wall. The shut-off valve is in here." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers in the darkness. He understood immediately. It was a desperate, dangerous plan. A gas leak could lead to an explosion. It would cause irreparable damage to his home. She didn't wait for his permission. This was her move. She reached into the closet, her hands finding the cold, familiar shape of the large valve. It was stiff from disuse. She put all her weight into it, grunting with the effort. It turned with a loud groan. The hiss of escaping gas was immediate, and the smell was acrid. She had crossed a line. She had deliberately endangered this house, this place that was his entire world. It was a morally gray act, born of sheer desperation. But it was an act of an ally, not a victim. The approaching footsteps faltered. Shouts of alarm echoed down the hall as the smell of gas spread. The diversion worked. Tatsuya grabbed her hand, his grip like steel. "Now," he said, and pulled her in the opposite direction, toward a hidden panel she never knew existed. They emerged into the cold night air, hidden in the shadows of the garden. The sounds of chaos faded behind them. They ran, hand in hand, through the snow until they reached a small, hidden garage containing a single, unassuming sedan. Inside a sterile, anonymous safe house in Shinjuku, the tension between them was a living thing. The adrenaline of the escape had faded, leaving behind a raw, vibrating silence. Tatsuya stood at the window, staring down at the neon-lit city, his back to her. She sat on the edge of a bed, her hands twisting in her lap. She noticed the blood then, a dark stain spreading across the sleeve of his white shirt, high on his bicep. A bullet had grazed him during the escape from the house. He hadn't said a word. "You're hurt," she said, her voice quiet. He glanced down at his arm, as if just noticing it. "It is nothing." "Let me see," she insisted, standing up. She walked to him, her fear replaced by a strange, fierce determination. He was her protector, but he was not invincible. She had saved him with her quick thinking. Now she would save him again, in this small way. He watched her approach, his expression guarded. She reached for his arm, and he didn't pull away. She carefully rolled up the blood-soaked fabric. The wound was a deep, angry gash, still weeping blood. The first aid kit in the safe house was well-stocked. She worked with a steady hand, cleaning the wound with antiseptic that made him hiss, her touch gentle but firm. He stood utterly still, his eyes locked on her face, watching the focused frown of her concentration. As she wrapped a clean bandage around his arm, her fingers brushed against the warm skin of his bicep. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "You are not afraid," he said, his voice a low rasp. It was not a question. "I am," she admitted, not looking up from her task. "But you're more afraid of being cold than you are of the fire." He knew she wasn't talking about the temperature. She was talking about his world, the violence, the danger. "For 10 years," he said, and his voice was so quiet she almost missed it. "Since my sister was killed, this is all I have known. The cold of control, the ice of discipline." He finally looked away from her, toward the window. "I did not feel warmth again, until tonight, in the snow, when I was afraid you were already gone." It was not a declaration of love. It was something far more dangerous. A confession. An admission of a crack in his perfectly constructed armor. He was telling her that she, the dismissed maid, had breached a defense that entire rival clans could not. Before she could process it, his phone buzzed. It was Kenji. Tatsuya listened, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. He ended the call and looked at her. The brief moment of vulnerability was gone, replaced by the chilling calm of a predator. The Kyokaikai failed to get to me, he said, his voice dangerously level. So they have changed their target. They know your name, Naomi. They know where your family lives in Atlanta. A message was just delivered to your mother's house. The floor dropped out from under her. The danger was no longer just his. It had crossed an ocean and landed on the doorstep of the only people in the world she had left. Her past had just become a weapon aimed directly at her heart. The safe house felt like a cage. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every distant siren a prelude to disaster. Naomi paced the small living area, her mind a maelstrom of fear for her family. Tatsuya stood by the window, a statue of controlled fury, speaking in low, rapid tones on the phone. He was giving orders, deploying his empire to shield a single family thousands of miles away. Men were dispatched in Atlanta. Surveillance was established. A net of protection was being woven around her mother and brother, a net she hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. When he finally hung up, the silence he left behind was absolute. They are safe, he said. It was a statement of fact, a promise backed by immense, unseen power. No one will touch them. Naomi stopped pacing and looked at him. Gratitude mingled with a terrifying understanding of the debt she was incurring. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Want. He turned from the window, and for the first time, she saw the conflict in his eyes. The cold, calculating boss was at war with the man who had confessed his own coldness to her. The Kyokaikai used you to show me a weakness. They believe you are my vulnerability. They are mistaken. He took a step toward her. You are my justification. They have made this personal. Now I will end them. His words should have terrified her. Instead, they ignited a spark of steel in her own spine. She was not just a victim to be protected. She was the cause. She had agency in this, whether she wanted it or not. You don't know them, she said, her mind working, piecing together fragments of conversations she'd overheard at the estate, gossip between staff, the whispers Tatsuya himself had let slip. But I think I do. The head of the clan. His name is Endo. He's old school. He has routines. Tatsuya's eyes narrowed. What routines? He eats at the same small restaurant in Ginza every Friday. A private room in the back. The owner owes him a debt of honor. Your men can't get near it without being seen. She took a breath, the idea forming, solidifying. It was insane. It was suicide. But it was hers. But I can. He stared at her, his face unreadable. No, the word was final. Absolute. You said it yourself. I was invisible as a maid. She pressed, her voice gaining strength. I'm a foreigner. A woman. No one would look twice at me waiting tables there for a night. I can get close. I can plant a listening device. I can confirm if he's planning another move against my family. This was her decisive act. She was no longer being dragged along by the current. She was choosing to dive into the heart of the storm. She would not be rescued passively. She would be part of the solution. I will not allow you to put yourself in that danger, he bit out, his control fraying. You don't have a choice, she countered, her gaze unwavering. This is my family. This is my fight now, too. You brought your world to my doorstep. Now let me help you burn it down. The raw defiance in her eyes, the sheer, unexpected force of her will, seemed to stun him into silence. He saw not a frightened girl, but a queen defending her territory. He had never met anyone like her. He had spent his life surrounded by men who followed his orders out of fear or loyalty. She followed no one. The cost was paid in the currency of risk. The plan was meticulously arranged. Kenji, through a series of threats and bribes, secured her a single night's employment at the Ginza restaurant. She was given a tiny listening device, no bigger than a grain of rice. The final confrontation was set. Naomi's hands trembled as she tied the simple black apron over her uniform. She looked in the mirror and saw a ghost of the girl she used to be, but her eyes were different. They were older, harder. Tatsuya stood behind her, his reflection next to hers. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and adjusted the collar of her shirt, his fingers brushing the side of her neck. It was a gesture of ownership, of claiming, a silent promise that he would be there, in the shadows, waiting. The restaurant was a blur of noise and steam. Naomi moved through the chaos, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She served tea, cleared plates, her face a mask of polite indifference. Finally, she was sent to the private room in the back. Endo was there, an old man with eyes like chips of obsidian, surrounded by his lieutenants. She served their sake, her hands steady, her gaze lowered. As she leaned over to place a bottle on the table, she let the listening device drop from her palm into the base of a floral arrangement. Her part was done. As she backed out of the room, her heart screaming, Endo looked up. His eyes met hers for a fleeting second. There was no recognition, no suspicion. To him, she was just part of the scenery. Invisible. She had never felt so powerful. The information from the device was exactly what Tatsuya needed. It confirmed the location of Endo's main operations, a weakness in his security, and the timeline for his next move. The final battle was swift and brutal. Tatsuya did not lead the charge himself. He commanded it from a distance, a general moving his pieces with surgical precision. He dismantled the Kyokaikai not with a bloody war, but with a series of targeted strikes that decapitated its leadership and scattered its soldiers. It was over by dawn. Naomi waited in the safe house, the silence stretching for an eternity. The sun was rising, painting the Tokyo sky in shades of pink and gold, when the door opened. Tatsuya walked in. He was not covered in blood, but he carried the weight of the night's violence around him like a shroud. One of his best men had been lost. A cost had been paid. Nothing in his world was free. He came to a stop in front of her. The city was waking up behind him, but in the small room, time had stopped. He looked at her, and the mask was gone. All his control, his discipline, his cold fury, it all fell away, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth in his eyes. He did not say he loved her. He did not apologize for the world he had dragged her into. He simply reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his thumbs stroking her cheek. "My home is your home," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "My safety is your safety. From this day forward, anyone who even thinks your name with malice will answer to the Ishikawagumi. It is done." It was not a proposal. It was a pronouncement. A claim made before gods and men, sealed in blood and violence. He was acknowledging what she was to him, what she had become, the center of his empire, the warmth in his cold world. She stood on the balcony of the master suite in the Ishikawa estate, looking out over the city. It was a week later. The snow had melted from the garden, revealing the intricate patterns of raked gravel beneath. She was no longer a maid, no longer a prisoner. She wore a deep red silk robe that felt impossibly soft against her skin. The air was crisp and clean. She was free to leave. A ticket to Atlanta, a new life, a bank account with more money than she had ever dreamed of. It was all hers for the asking. He had offered it himself, but she hadn't taken it. The thought of the quiet life she'd left behind felt like a faded photograph of a stranger. It felt cold. She touched the cool glass of the railing, the choice settling not in her mind, but in her bones. It wasn't about forgiveness or even love, not yet. It was a simpler, more primal decision. She was choosing the fire over the ice, the dangerous warmth of his world over the lonely cold of her own. In the reflection on the glass, she saw him step out onto the balcony, behind her. He didn't touch her, just stood there, a silent, unmovable presence at her back. A guardian. A king. Her king.